Red card after two holes.
1 hour behind your back.
That's what we're working at. Okay, you're very welcome to this week's webcast and part of our series of breakfast webcasts on organisational change here from Communicate International. My name is Peter Finnegan, Managing Director of Communicate International, and my two panellists here today are two great associates of ours. We've got Mick O'Connell here, who's an expert on organisational change, and Frank Drum, who's a barrister and an expert in all the area of HR and IR. The topic we're dealing with today was one that a number of people got onto us about, because we seem to have been talking about over the past while. We're talking about organisational change in the context of one organisation. And a number of people said to us, why don't you talk to us about organisational change in the context of mergers and acquisitions? So we're going to touch on that today. We may expand on it further, probably more on mergers and acquisitions today, because I think that was what the people were asking us to do. Nonetheless, in mergers and acquisitions, Mick, there's a fair difference between mergers and acquisitions, really, isn't there? I mean, in terms of the dynamic.
Not every acquisition is a merger.
Yeah.
In the sense that you can have a lot of acquisitions. If you look at Irish companies like the Kerry Group or CRH, extremely successful companies, and to a great extent they have grown by acquisition. So you wanted to expand into new markets, you acquire a company, and sometimes you can run it as a standalone company. You can actually, of course, impose your own efficiencies and way of running the business, but to a great extent, the level of integration with your existing operations may not be very high. In other instances where two companies merge, you see recently a lot of examples in the pharmaceutical sector and banking sector where big organisations merge. That's where a lot of the difficulties arise, because the level of integration required between the two companies is very high. You're saying the rationale is because we're going to achieve a lot of efficiencies, or because 1 + 1 = 3. We're actually going to, our combined resources are going to achieve a lot more than if we remained two separate entities.
Right. Because I see that we've been involved in both acquisitions and in mergers. They kind of run together, I suppose, in the phrase, but the dynamic is very different, and from a legal perspective as well, there are different things around there, Frank, in terms of the way that works out.
Well, as Mick said, it's not to be too simplistic. There is a huge difference between a merger and acquisition. Yeah. If company A is taking over company B, very much it is in the driving seat.
Yeah,
it's paying the money. The fundamental first principles, caveat emptor.
Yeah.
You're buying a company at any scale, big or small. You better beware what you're buying. So you better know what's in the pot.
Yeah.
And that means fundamentally, I know, due diligence, no matter at what level you're doing it at. It's absolutely important. And in recent due diligence that I was advising on, two areas came up, which I just want to be specific. Where people really hadn't thought through what they were at. One was on the pension scheme,
right?
Whereby they hadn't really looked into how the pension scheme, particularly now that there's lots of difficulties in funding of pension schemes, and the other was in the whole area of transfer of undertakings, whereby liabilities in relation to the people they were taking over. And indeed, I was involved in a recent case whereby, in relation to the transfer of undertakings, a small operation, employer A gave an undertaking to employer B that nobody would transfer, and he gave an employer B and sought and got an indemnity that if there was any implications out of the transfer of undertakings, they would be indemnified. And lo and behold, a row broke out over one individual who they tried to make redundant prior to the transfer, and ended up in the High Court. So transfer of undertakings is a huge area just to be aware of.
I could add a third one to that. I mean, I think because you've got the transfer of undertakings as a key issue, but when you're doing your due diligence, I think a lot of companies do get obsessed with the legalities and the financials and forget any due diligence on the culture aspect. And later on, when you look at what has happened, partly one of the reasons why they failed is they haven't looked at the difficulties in terms of integrating two different cultures. So the due diligence, I suppose, just to reinforce the point, that know what you're getting into, caveat emptor.
Okay.
Well, the culture aspect is the most difficult of the whole lot.
Yes.
You can quantify
the legalities of the
financials. You can quantify what's in the books, pretty much, but it's that whole area of culture and the perception. And I've noticed of late, lots of acquisitions are being sort of sold as mergers to avoid this sort of sense of one culture taking over the other culture.
Yeah, that's something we spoke about actually earlier before we came on air. We're talking about the fact that that there is a mix-up sometimes between acquisitions and mergers. Mergers really are supposed to be a merger of equals, isn't that much a merger of equals? And can there ever be a merger of equals?
In my experience, no. I've rarely seen it, and I've rarely seen it work. It has generally always been an acquisition whereby over time the dominant culture takes over.
Yeah,
now,
I think
if it doesn't,
yeah,
that's where you have the
it's
difficulty.
true. I mean, if you read the research, Daimler, Benz, and Chrysler is the classic example that's always given on this, where the two chief executives appeared and said, "This is a perfect merger of equals. This is what we're going to achieve." 9 months later, they had to go back to the market and say, "Unfortunately, we're not in a position to achieve what we anticipated we would." What happened was that Daimler sought ultimately to impose themselves on Chrysler. Chrysler senior executives said, we feel like lame ducks in the whole enterprise, and a key number of senior executives left. So, and partly one of the reasons for a merger as well is because you're taking over human capital, you're taking over capability, and in a lot of instances where it don't work, the reason why a lot of it leaves because it feels like it's the party that's taken over, it's not engaged, there's issues of mistrust, and they disappear and go elsewhere. And you're looking then at bringing new people into a merged organisation that is just trying to find its feet.
But there's huge planning goes into it. One of the mergers I was involved in terms of the pulling together of two organisations who were meant to be a merger of equals, and they really tried very hard to do it. It took months of planning to make sure that it actually happened, and as the organisations were coming closer together, just on the practical front, the amount of communication, the amount of work that went into that was phenomenal. Now what they did in that situation was, and if anybody is doing this, it's a very good model for it. Obviously, when the day came when this was to happen, they had done a lot of groundwork beforehand in terms of letting people know the reason, the rationale behind it, why it was there, what would be good for them. But then to get the two groups at the top decided that every unit within the two organisations were to get together with kind of a cross party, well, not even cross function either. It was between the two organisations. They met together to see practically what needed to be done. But the interesting thing about the way that actually worked was that rather than, if you get, say, the two groups down the side of the table, one company, one part of the merger, the other side of the merger over here, they started to talk and they started to figure out what were, in our particular unit, what were the practical difficulties going to be and the issues were going to be. They came out on the table and they were supposed to resolve them. But of course they didn't resolve them. They resolved a fair amount of them, and they sent most of the problems up to the top.
Yeah.
The top listened to them, as it were, sent them back down again. Yeah. And made them sort them out again themselves. Then it was discussed again, but each time, as you could see it, because I was at some of those tables, the difficult decisions were always parked to one side and sent up to the central committee to sort it out. But each time the central committee listened to it and bounced it back down again. It was fascinating to watch it, because as they bounced it back down again, well, you sort it out, and you sort it, because everybody here wanted to pass the buck on the hard and difficult questions. And it worked very well, and they got it, I'd say, to about